Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and on this week's episode, we're talking about everyone's favorite confederation. No, not that one, or that one, and maybe not that one either. Yes, it's that one! It's Concacaf, the Confederation of North, Central America, and Caribbean Association Football. It's a confusing one. Let's get our Concacaf on, shall we, Graham Ruthven?
Yeah, let's get Concacaf out of our mind on this episode, shall we? Or Concacafinated? I don't know. What do you prefer?
Daryl once tried to do, Concacaf, which was a portmanteau of Conga Line and Concacaf, and it was not well received, nor should it have been. So I think you'd have to work hard to beat that pun.
Yeah, clearly. It could be Concacaf.
But let's talk about CONCACAF, shall we? The confederation that governs soccer in North America and the Caribbean. For now, we'll see if that changes. Founded in 1961, or I should say merged in 1961 to become its own thing. The confederation has seen its fair share of growth and scandal since that time, including ongoing extradition battles and a Trump Tower apartment just for cats. However, the future of CONCACAF appears brighter than ever, particularly with an expanded 48-team World Cup in 2026, an event that will be hosted in CONCACAF territory, the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. As CONCACAF continues to distance itself from its troubled past, its challenge remains balancing the interests of its diverse membership, from soccer powerhouses like Mexico and the United States to smaller Caribbean and Central American nations with limited resources. Here with me to break it all down, Mr. Graham Ruthven. I already introduced him. Graham, how excited are you, generally speaking, to talk about CONCACAF?
I mean, very, very excited. It's the greatest confederation in the world, depending on who you ask.
See, there it is. Depending on who you ask. I'm jumping to the end of this one, which I think we have in the running order, sort of like how is it perceived? And I think my one of my first real introductions to this was when an English friend of mine, before we started doing the show, I was talking to him about World Cup qualifying, and he was kind of good-naturedly listening, and then after I finished my entire spiel about how excited I was for the hex to begin, said, but it doesn't really matter though, right? You're playing Costa Rica and Panama. England is playing Greece and I feel Germany this window.
Albania and Latvia this
there
weekend
is that.
At the start of World Cup qualifying.
But that is a very good point. But I think when you are a person who lives within CONCACAF territory, cares about CONCACAF quite a bit, there is a sort of maybe a little bit of blinders, and I think a perceived idea that it's a very important one that everyone's paying attention to. It does feel like maybe it's the fourth most important confederation for someone who doesn't have a rooting interest in CONCACAF.
Yeah, I mean, even then, would you rank it? I'm just thinking completely objectively here in a global sense. Obviously, I've got a little bit of an outside perspective here. I think maybe some people would even look to the AFC with Australia and Japan and South Korea. It's comparable, right, to say, compare Canada and the US and Mexico there, but it's definitely a confederation that is defined by the inequality between different tiers of teams, where you do have this clear superpower, and obviously every confederation has that. You certainly have that in UEFA, but the teams in the second and third tier don't have the resources, don't have the riches, don't have the same level of heritage, and so that does lead to a little bit of a peculiar arena for qualification and competitions to take place in.
Maybe average England supporter is the wrong way to go with this one, but if you ask somebody who focuses on UEFA how many CONCACAF nations could they list, do you think you're getting more than 10?
No.
That's it? All right, cool. Cool. I just wanted to make sure we were starting off on the same
41,
page.
right? 41 member nations. I think most people here in the UK would get 5 or 6.
The USA, California, I think you get those separated right away, and then we're off and running. So let's look back at the history of the Confederation. As I mentioned, founded in 1961 in Mexico City. I did not know a lot of the history until researching this question. Did not know that Mexico and the United States were both members of the North American Football Confederation, the NAFC. And you then had the, not South American, but the Confederación Centro America y del Caribe de Fútbol, which is basically Central America and the Caribbean nations. Because you had two separate and distinct organizations, you had issues in terms of who was kind of governing soccer in the region. You didn't have as much kind of focus on the region, limited as it still may be, and so you merge those two together. Now you've got the entire continent and the Caribbean. You've got them all together. You've got them under one umbrella, and it's all smooth sailing from there.
Yeah, and there are 13 founding members to that initial CONCACAF merging, and obviously it's grown over the decades. I just mentioned that there are 41 member nations now, so of course one of those is the USA. You've got Mexico, Canada, Costa Rica, Panama. If you look at the Americas, Panama is the line. So over the border from Panama is Colombia. That's the border between CONCACAF and CONMEBOL, which is the confederation for South America. Anything north than that, certainly in terms of landmass, is CONCACAF. So that is the borderline. I guess it's worth, let's strip it all the way back and just kind of do a very quick beat on what actually a confederation is. So in soccer you have 6 confederations. In Europe you have UEFA, in Africa it's CAF, it's CONMEBOL, in South America Asia is the AFC, and in North America, Central America and the Caribbean it's CONCACAF. And the confederations they're not part of FIFA, but to be a member of FIFA you also have to be a member of a confederation. And there is a relationship between FIFA and CONCACAF because they actually hand control of World Cup qualification to the confederation. So CONCACAF, obviously the US, Mexico and Canada are not having to qualify for this World Cup as hosts, but normally they would be involved in the qualification process for the World Cup. That is controlled by CONCACAF. Then there's a handover for the World Cup itself to FIFA. And of course, CONCACAF itself has a number of tournaments that it controls solely. So between the two, FIFA and the Confederation, they control the sport, certainly in international soccer, but also in a number of different ways as well, and in club soccer with some competitions. The two of those are the governing bodies that control a lot of the game.
So those tournaments would be the Gold Cup on the men's side, the CONCACAF Champions League, CONCACAF Nations League, and then you've got newer competitions on the women's side of the game as well, and then obviously World Cup qualifying for the women too. Yeah,
you've got a lot of youth competitions there as well. So
Truth.
U20 Championship, U17, and as you say, Taylor, not just men's football, CONCACAF have control over the women's game in the region as well. So the W Gold Cup, W Championship, again a lot of youth competitions. The W Champions Cup on the club side of things as well. So yeah, there's actually, when you look at the list, there's a lot more than you might think, because instinctively I'm thinking the W Gold Cup, the Nations League, the Champions Cup. But once you add in the youth tournaments and even things like the CONCACAF Central American Cup, the Caribbean Cup, which is actually something I had, the Caribbean Cup was something I had in the newsletter fairly recently, so I was aware of that. There's quite a lot for them to busy themselves with over the course of the year.
Oh yeah, and it's what makes the Confederation unique and fascinating, and then also really challenging at the same time, because you have the United States and Mexico, you all the way down to Guam, and really tiny nations that don't have a ton of football funding, don't have a ton of infrastructure, and that can make it really tricky when it comes to, say, World Cup qualification, but it can also make it really tricky for how do you sort of raise the level of the game and the quality of the game across all of your member nations? How do you support the growth of the game at a grassroots level and development and infrastructure and all of those things, without maybe erring into corruption and bribery, which is a thing that has happened on more than one occasion, because it's just you have so many disparate nations spread across such a wide array of geography and time zones even. It just becomes, I think, a tricky thing to organize efficiently and effectively, but it's something that they still have to do because you need an organizer. I would argue you need a better organizer with a better name. I'm going to throw that out right now, Graham. In looking at CONCACAF as a name, kind of dumb, I think. Not just that it's a very long one to say, but that it's the Confederation of North, Central America, and Caribbean Association of Football. I feel like you've got to go like CONCACAF and make it Confederation of North America, Central America. Otherwise, it's just very confusing to me right away.
Is it better or worse than CONMEBOL? Because CONMEBOL is has a bit of a mouthful as well.
The N and the M together makes it confusing for sure.
I think that makes it worse.
Yeah.
CONMEBOL is a difficult one to say, but yeah, CONCACAF. There's a rhythmic quality. I don't know. You could remix something out of that. You get a club beat out of something. Someone saying CONCACAF. Let's make it happen.
Sure,
I'll work on that.
And now the conga line comes in. Graham, in terms of the governmental history of CONCACAF, it feels like it really becomes a talking point around a certain individual by the name of Jack Warner is where maybe we sort of start with the governance and operation of the Confederation, even if it goes back much further than that.
Yeah, I don't think you can really talk about the history of CONCACAF without mentioning the Jack Warner era because it was absolutely wild, and it was also part of something that went beyond CONCACAF and went into the downfall of FIFA during that period as well. So for 21 years, between 1990 and 2011, Jack Warner, he was the president of CONCACAF, and he was this dominating character in that position. Very forthright with his thoughts, of which he had many. Someone who definitely transcended that role within CONCACAF. At the moment, Taylor, I don't know whether this was just me being ignorant. I had to Google who the current president of CONCACAF is. Victor Montagliani is the current president. He's a former president of the Canadian Soccer Association, so maybe I was a little bit more familiar with him in that role. Also sits on the FIFA Council. Jack Warner, nobody had to Google Jack Warner during that time. He was genuinely thought of as one of the biggest global power brokers in soccer during this time. He's from Trinidad and Tobago, and basically one of the things he realised very quickly was the way that CONCACAF was set up with those 41 member nations, he could maintain control by using the Caribbean islands as his power base. Right?
It's the João Havilange approach, right?
Exactly.
When he becomes FIFA president, is
totally.
Find all the smaller nations, put them all together, you have a giant voting bloc. Yeah,
totally. And that's actually become a bit of a defining trend in football governance to this day. Gianni Infantino does exactly the same thing as FIFA president. So he maybe wasn't a pioneer of it, as you say, João Havilange as FIFA president, maybe pioneered this approach. But Jack Warner and CONCACAF took it to an extreme level, shall we say. So as long as he kept the Caribbean nations happy, and he did that in various ways we can maybe go into, their votes at Congress would keep him in power because, of course, every nation, Jamaica has one vote, the USA has one vote, Panama has one vote, Mexico has one vote. And so he didn't need to keep the largest number of people happy in terms of population. He just needed to keep the largest number of member nations happy, which is what he did in various ways.
And then, not to paint with too broad of a brush, but, I mean, to that point, if you are going to try to bribe the Mexican Federation, which has a massive soccer infrastructure, a massive soccer media landscape, it's a much bigger endeavor. When you are going to bribe or attempt to influence, would maybe be the better legalese way of saying it, smaller nations where there isn't nearly as much coverage or attention to detail, or where money is going to go a lot further, it becomes an easier kind of thing to pursue. And that's where I think Jack Warner was smart in his approach, but then maybe not maybe corrupt, but was corrupt in how he applied it. And that's where you would get millions of dollars devoted to a training center in Trinidad that then was basically a field that they mowed and put up 2 goals on. And that cost $5 million, apparently. There's ways to sort of incentivize smaller nations to vote for you by giving the federations a sizable chunk of money and then not really policing entirely what they do to develop the game, quote unquote, just as long as they vote the way you need them to.
Yeah, and that's where there is a difficult balance to this discussion, because a lot of those Caribbean countries, while they might not have got the full amount of that funding for their facilities, they did get a facility of sorts. So maybe they did end up in a better position for Jack Warner.
Unless they're Haiti, in which case they didn't get that $750,000 that was supposed to go to them.
Yes, other than that, there are many exceptions. And it was maybe worth listing some of the controversies that Jack Warner was involved
How much time you got?
With. So, yeah, there's a long list. So this is just a selection. There was a ticket scandal at the 2006 World Cup when a company owned by Warner was selling tickets at a huge markup, and there were allegations that basically those tickets had come from Warner's relationship from FIFA. So he was sourcing the tickets from FIFA, then selling them on through his company. There was a scandal when Scotland played, I remember this, when Scotland played Trinidad and Tobago in a friendly, and as with any of these these friendly matches, there's a fee involved. And when the Scottish FA asked Warner who to make the check out to, he told them to make it out to himself, rather than to the association. There was another story where the former chairman of the FA, the English FA, accused Warner of requesting money to vote for England to host the 2018 World Cup. That one's fairly blatant, pretty brazen. There are all kinds of murky business related to the sale of TV rights, several incidents there. But then in 2015 it got real, because Jack Warner was indicted on charges of wire fraud, racketeering and money laundering, and ultimately he was ordered to repay $79 million that he had fraudulently obtained from CONCACAF in his role.
79? Sorry, I didn't have that number.
79 million, yeah, that's what I found.
That's a lot of money, Graham. That's a lot of money. Wow.
That's a
all
lot
right.
of training centres that Haiti didn't get.
Yeah, that was yes, it was, and that was by the U.S. Department of Justice, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
So he is. That was what I alluded to in the introduction. I believe he is still fighting extradition at present because they use what U.S. banks and U.S. infrastructure to do a lot of these transactions, or at least some of these transactions. That's how it then falls inside U.S. jurisdiction, is my understanding. Should note, it's not just like the Caribbean or anything like that plays a role in this, because Chuck Blazer, then CONCACAF General Secretary, is the other one I alluded to in the introduction, was using CONCACAF funds to, as I said, have an apartment for just his cats, amongst many, many other things. Rafael Salgado of Guatemala was also a CONCACAF representative, was also indicted and pled guilty to accepting bribes in connection with broadcast rights, as well as, I think, some level of connection to the candidacy of not Mohammed bin Salman, who was running for president, Mohammed bin Hammam, running for FIFA presidency, some corruption there, and then maybe also the awarding of World Cups in 2018 and 2022 as well.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the Chuck Blazer story, that, by the way, the story about him paying $6,000 a month for an apartment in Trump Tower solely for his cats.
It was a long time ago too. Like, that would probably be a significantly higher number these days. But yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the all-time tales in soccer history. And what's interesting about the whole Chuck Blazer episode is, which lasted a number of years, he was general secretary for, I think, exactly the same period that Jack Warner was president, so from 1990 to 2011. So again, he was someone who transcended that role. Like, I couldn't really tell you off the top of my head. It's in my research further up my notes who the General Secretary of CONCACAF is just now. But Chuck Blazer was this larger-than-life figure. And what was
literally,
interesting was...
kind of?
Yeah,
if
quite
people,
literally.
I just want to say,
life.
if people are new to this, don't know who Chuck Blazer is, I need you to pause for a moment and do your best to think. What do I think an American soccer businessman looks like... and then Google him, and you won't be disappointed.
Yeah, picture the kind of guy who would have an apartment in Trump Tower solely for his cats. You're there, pretty much. But basically what I found interesting was him and Warner were like loggerheads for a lot of their time as General Secretary and President together. But it was just so institutional, the corruption at CONCACAF. They were both, even though they were a lot of the times on opposite sides of things, they were both still essentially doing the same thing. And what eventually transpired for Blazer was he was used by the FBI as an informant and became key to the investigation into FIFA, which blew up the entire organisation in 2015 and culminated in that morning in that hotel in Zurich. Which was such an incredible story. I remember where I was when I was watching that happening on the news, and Chuck Blazer essentially provided the information to the FBI to make that happen.
And I believe one of the things that he pled guilty to there was accepting bribes to award the World Cup to South Africa. So it's not even just Qatar and Russia that are maybe under the microscope or should be under the microscope. You can go back to 2010. I'm going to assume you can go back further than that to World Cups in the 70s, 80s, maybe even the 90s. Maybe we do some digging into how the U.S. got that first World Cup. Because it does just feel like this is an institutional problem. It seems to be an institutional problem at times with FIFA and with different confederations around the world. So I'm not sure if you can ever fully remove self-interested decision-making from global soccer and global soccer governance. I think it's what makes us just sort of generally dislike FIFA and the bureaucracies and governmental organizations that run the sport, is that there's a feeling that they're never truly kind of following their mandate of helping, develop the world and spread unity by growing the global game and the beautiful game. It feels like there is always going to be an element of self-enrichment and self-importance to soccer governance. And that is definitely painted with too broad of a brush. At the same time, numerous federal indictments make me feel like I'm okay in saying some of that. And the fact that Jack Warner can't contest this, because to do so he'd have to be in the United States, and he can't be in the United States, also makes me feel comfortable.
Oh, he probably can be in Scotland, though. I'm coming to the US. Yeah.
Yeah. So
extraditing myself to the US now.
The other thing that I think is such an interesting part of soccer in CONCACAF, moving away from governments and malpractice and all that, is just the strangeness of playing in CONCACAF, because you're playing in really disparate conditions where you might have high altitude games in Mexico City with a lot of traffic and pollution making it really difficult to breathe. But you could get sweltering humidity in Central America and the Caribbean. You get just different levels of infrastructure in the facilities you are playing in. The U.S. once playing a friendly in Cuba in a stadium that did not have running water. Like, you get just really different conditions in the infrastructure, in the location itself, but then also you might get pitches that have deliberately not been mowed because it's going to slow down passing and make it really difficult. You might get pitches that have been allowed to be waterlogged because that's going to make it difficult to possess the ball and keep it moving. Ask the U.S. against Trinidad and Cuba, and that's a good reminder of that. So you just get these really disparate locations, really disparate facilities where you might be playing, and it creates a really interesting contrast.
Yeah, and CONCACAF has become this. We've done it already in the show. It's become this. We use it as a punchline and we indulge in it. And I think it's meant to be taken quite lightly. It's meant almost as a term of endearment. But as you say there, Taylor, if you boil it down, it's bad pitches and hostile environments and dodgy refereeing and physical teams. I don't think those things are exclusive to CONCACAF. But what is perhaps unique to this confederation is how often the top dogs are exposed to those inequalities, right? So in UEFA, you'll have England playing San Marino or whatever, Gibraltar or whatever, every so often. But those mismatches seem to happen more often in CONCACAF because you have this top tier that isn't as large as it is in UEFA. Like 41 members is not a small. CONMEBOL has what, 10? 10 members in CONMEBOL? Like, CONCACAF is not a small in terms of the membership confederation. But within those 41 members, you have the US, Canada, Mexico that are quite clearly a tier one. And so those teams and with those resources and those finances are in the minority, and that's where it's different between UEFA and some of the other confederations. So you will see the US play in those pitches or in those stadiums or in those circumstances more often than you would France or Germany or Italy or even in CONMEBOL, where it's a much smaller confederation. But we mean it like in a light-hearted sense. It's all, as I say, it's a term of endearment. It's fun to talk about those things being CONCACAF-y, but it does also highlight the inequality that holds back a lot of the nations in this region. So there is a serious point to that discussion as well.
Yeah, there is, certainly, because I think you can get that sort of like the haves and have-nots aspect of things being CONCACAF-y or the perceived haves and have-nots. But then I think it can also be kind of strategies on display, like when you put the away locker room directly underneath your most like ardent supporters with a very minimal ceiling between the two, so that you get the ceiling tiles bouncing when the U.S. is playing in Guatemala or Honduras or the like, or you get fireworks and flares and fire alarms pulled at team hotels when they're on road trips. Like there is an element of sort of anything we can do to find a way to win, we are going to do when these countries are playing larger powers like Mexico and the United States. And it should then be noted, there is also the history of American geopolitics in the region that definitely factors into it from an American perspective. The U.S. has intervened in Latin America massively more than anywhere else in the world, going back hundreds of years. There's going to be some bad blood. There's going to be some ill will. And when you have the opportunity to stick it to the United States on the soccer pitch, you are going to do that. And so that can lead to certainly more like aggression from supporters, or more hostility from supporters is a better way to put it. But then also maybe harsher tackles, just a more physical game, a more willingness to kind of get stuck in the dark arts against the United States, but also against each other. Lest we forget, there's been a war called the Soccer War, fought between, I believe, Honduras and El Salvador. There's plenty of bad blood across CONCACAF as well that leads to some of that physicality and ill will between nations.
Yeah, a lot of the games remind me of like classic cup ties in that sense. So you do see it elsewhere in Scotland in soccer, but it is maybe a little bit unusual to see it so often at the top level of a confederation.
And especially when you then get imbalanced competitions like you might get in the Gold Cup, where you have smaller nations making it, but not always making it in a way that allows them to compete consistently. You get some level of officiating inconsistency based on, availability of classes and funding for referees and the like. So you might not always get the same level across all games, all teams, but you also have different styles of play in different leagues where those officials are officiating on a more regular basis. So then you might have a different referee who's used to different things in Costa Rica. If they're then officiating USA and Canada, they might call the game differently than a Canadian official would or a Haitian official would. It leads to a lot of different contrasts and on occasion conflict that I think is part of that appeal. That's where, Graham, to your point, it is sort of good-natured when we talk about CONCACAFing. Even when it's really frustrating and feels like maybe there's some cheating going on, it still is the endearing part of the insanity of CONCACAF.
Yeah, the Scot in me loves it. Like, that's Scottish football. It's like everything you've just described is Scottish football. So
yeah,
I feel very at home.
Except in 115 degrees with pure humidity, which is the thing
that is not very Scottish. Yeah, that's right.
Every dual national who's never played for the United States who comes over and has to play a road qualifier in Central America, I think comes away needing an oxygen tank and also needing a recalibration of just how easy it's going to be to play against CONCACAF opposition if you're an American, and maybe other nations as well. Graham, which then leads to the question of what happens going forward for CONCACAF. Like, will we see more changes in the Confederation? From a governance standpoint, Montaliani has thus far not involved him in any sort of legal controversy or anything along those lines, so good for him. There are other nations that could potentially join CONCACAF, so we could see an expansion in terms of member states. Greenland, I think, is one that gets mentioned a lot, although they could just join via the United States. You never know what's going to happen there. Graham, the other one that gets sort of mentioned from time to time, especially as we move towards 48-team World Cups and then 64-team World Cups, is the idea of merging CONCACAF with CONMEBOL and just having a basically Western Hemisphere confederation, double confederation. I don't know what it would be at that point.
Yeah, so that discussion has been around for a while, particularly since the two confederations, CONCACAF and CONMEBOL, they signed a strategic agreement to collaborate. I'm just reading some of the statement here. To collaborate on things together, very vague things. They didn't really go into what that collaboration will look like, but that was signed in 2023, and obviously the Copa America was held in the US last year, and the US, Canada, and Mexico. Was there a fourth one as well? Were Costa Rica invited? Anyway, CONCACAF teams were invited to that competition.
It was
so
six,
it's only
right? Because there's
6
10
teams, right?
In CONMEBOL.
Yeah, Panama. The US played Panama, right? That's the Tim Weah game, so Panama were certainly invited. Yeah, a number of teams, somewhere between 4 and 6 teams, were invited to Copa America from CONCACAF last year, and also you had the Copa America Centenario as well being hosted in the US not so long ago. So it's only natural that the discussion then leads to a full merger. I guess there would be, Taylor, you talked about the geographical challenges of CONCACAF.
Yeah,
there would be real challenges to having a confederation that covers basically half the world between CONCACAF and CONMEBOL. But I've said before on the show, on the main feed show, I think the target for the US, if we're taking a US-centric view of things here, should be to make that invitation to the Copa America a permanent thing.
Yeah.
So that the US is consistently playing high-caliber opponents. I think a Copa America not hosted on US soil that the US is invited to would be hugely valuable, because so far I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Taylor, but so far the invitations have, and certainly in the last two competitions, have been purely to US hosted tournaments.
The US played on the road for Copa America in like 95, I think.
Right, okay.
I don't know if they've done it since then.
So that again would be, if that were to happen again, that would be hugely valuable, I think. The difficulty is you don't want to leave behind the other smaller CONCACAF countries. I'm just talking about the inequality that exists in the Confederation already. So, I don't know. There's a world where I think it could work. I guess a full merger would facilitate a full Copa America, or Copa Americas, if you want to rebrand it a little bit, with qualification, and you have CONCACAF and CONMEBOL teams qualifying for that tournament. But it feels some way off. Despite the fact that I do have a sense that in general world soccer is at a real crossroads where you have a political tug of war between FIFA and UEFA, and it feels like Infantino's trying to grab more power by expanding the World Cup and making the Club World Cup more of a thing. So CONCACAF and CONMEBOL, the confederations, are trying to navigate that, and I do think we are going to see more collaboration between confederations and federations. So it's not out of the question, but maybe a little bit far off in the distance for a full merger.
Can I tell you why I think it's very far off? Like what I think the major stumbling block would be? Because You've already outlined the most logical one, which is just like, can you imagine playing like a road qualifier in Canada and then playing a road qualifier in Argentina? Like that would be a bit of travel, I think, involved. I guess
You could get around that though, right? Like you could have.
Oh yeah. Oh no.
The regions
sure.
within the confederation, so it's almost like you have regional qualifiers for Concacaf, then for CONMEBOL. There would be a way to be a way to work it.
That's not the biggest stumbling block. Okay. Nor is it even like the competitive imbalance, because there would be one. You would have an issue of South American teams, generally speaking, are probably, if you combine the two, and then you have, let's say, you'd have like 13 or 14 or 15 qualifying spots for a World Cup if you're going with an even more expanded World Cup. I feel like South America is going to get 8 of those, maybe just 7, but still, for their 10-member nations now, like there is the idea of an imbalance. There would be the idea of a funding imbalance then, how much money is going to the kind of the bigger dogs if you had a combined federation versus the smaller nations that need more money. But honestly, I think the biggest hurdle would be the administrative side of things. I don't think CONCACAF officials would want to lose power to CONMEBOL officials and vice versa. You have different styles of management. You have different languages spoken. You have different workplace cultures. I think really that would be it. I think neither administrative side would want to lose power, and neither group would want to kind of yield power to the other. And that is the thing that ultimately I think would keep things from happening, is just that suits don't want to lose power and don't want to lose money. So those suits are going to do everything they can to maintain their individuality.
Taylor, as a US fan, how would you feel about... I mean, the US you would hope they'd qualify for the majority of World Cups, but they would miss... It would happen at some point. They would miss a World Cup through or two. How would you... I mean, obviously it already happened through CONCACAF, but that felt like a bit of an anomaly. It would be a little bit more of a natural consequence for the US to miss out on qualification every so often. Would you accept that in terms of progressing the US as a superpower? The hope is ultimately that you kind of get beyond that stage and they become one of the big players in that region.
So my heart says yes, because you want to be a big power in the region, and to do that you have to beat bigger powers, and you have to kind of recognize that if we want to get to that level, similar to what we had to do to close the gap on Mexico, is like you have to get more people playing, you have to have more money behind it, you have to have more interest. That's the only way you're going to catch up. But my head says no, because ultimately I think the U.S. would really struggle. Going on the road, it's not like we haven't intervened historically in South America either. So I feel like there would be a lot of negative reaction to the U.S. playing a road qualifier in, let's just say, Venezuela. Might not be the simplest thing. So I just think it would still be as many of the issues the U.S. has going on the road for CONCACAF World Cup qualifying, except now it's at even a higher elevation if you're playing Ecuador or Bolivia, against more hostile fan bases if you are pretty much all of South America, and then better talent across the board as well. I think it would really limit the U.S.'s ability to qualify automatically. It would make it a bigger deal and mean that the U.S. had improved and earned that spot. I'm not sure I'm willing to give up the regularity of a World Cup visit for the chance to maybe beat Brazil in a qualifier on the road.
Okay, well, if it does happen and the US leaves CONCACAF, I know we're talking about a merger, but let's just say the US in this scenario leaves CONCACAF to go to CONMEBOL. Can you promise me that Scotland will get the CONCACAF spot? Because I feel better about our chances of qualifying through CONCACAF.
Hey, man. Jersey, I believe the island nation of Jersey was considering trying to apply for CONCACAF membership because it's the next closest confederation outside of UEFA. Maybe Scotland goes the same way. I don't know who's closer to Scotland than North America, so let's make it happen. Yeah. Maybe there's another one.
I mean, if Greenland are getting in,
right?
Like,
come on over.
Why not?
Come on over, Scotland. It'd be fine. There's no historical animosity towards Scots anywhere, I don't think, right? Outside of England, so you'd be fine.
No, I mean, we gave you Craig Ferguson, so the least you can give us is a place in CONCACAF.
We will take him gladly. One of my favorite late night hosts. Maybe my favorite late night host ever. He's up there. It's him and Letterman, I think, are 1 and 2 for me.
He's good, yeah. You would not find a Scot on the street here who would know who he is.
Really?
Yeah, he has absolutely no... I only know who he is because, obviously, I'm a little bit more in tune to American culture and TV and stuff. But yeah, he's no imprint over here culturally.
Really?
Yeah.
I find that shocking, but okay. Well, that's your loss, and we will take him. I think he is an American citizen now as well. So, in your face, Scotland. He's ours. You can't come to CONCACAF, but he can. Graham, any other thoughts on the greatest / 4th or 5th greatest confederation in the world?
Not just I'm looking forward to obviously these episodes are evergreen, but we're recording a day tomorrow the Nations League semi-finals kick off, so I'm looking forward to those games. I do think the Nations League has been a moderate success, not just in CONCACAF but around the world, and so it's one of the things that CONCACAF has adopted from global soccer that I think has improved the ecosystem and the landscape. So I'm looking forward to those games.
I am too, and I think with that in mind, the other reason why I wouldn't want a merger is because I do think there has been growth and improvement in CONCACAF soccer on the whole. And I think, to be fair, a lot of that has to do with basically pulling in diaspora populations or dual nationals that wouldn't be able to represent their other nation, like Suriname, Curacao, are like the primary examples of that. But I think it's what the U.S. did time and time again to kind of raise the standard and make sure that they had good talents in there. Canada has done the same. Mexico has done the same. So it feels like in that way, you do start to have maybe a rising tide lifting some boats that haven't been lifted previously. And so I think to keep the kind of perennial powers in the Confederation, but then hopefully push for more development in soccer at the lower levels to make it more competitive across the board is what you ultimately want, and is maybe then facilitating better soccer and more soccer around the world. And that should be our goal at the end of the day. Playing sports and being at a team better than fighting and yelling at each other or bribery and embezzlement. So that's my official stance, Graham. I know that you in the past have been pro bribery and embezzlement, but I'm going to push you to be pro soccer this time.
I've swithered on that back and forth over the course of my life. But yeah, long live CONCACAF.
Oh, and on that note, Graham is now the Secretary General of CONCACAF? Wow. All right. Congratulations, Graham. I look forward to seeing what you do with your tens of millions of embezzled dollars. Until then, Graham Ruthven, thank you for not stealing from the Total Soccer Show or Soccer 101.
Thank you, Taylor.
That I know of. Listeners, thank you all for the same and for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.